The forensic accountant set down her pen and looked directly at my Uncle Thomas across the mahogany conference table. We'd been in depositions for 6 hours. Thomas sat there in his $1,000 suit, flanked by 2 defense attorneys, radiating the same arrogant confidence he'd worn for the past 18 months since he'd stolen my father's company. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice steady as steel, "can you explain why your brother Patrick's signature on this will shows a tremor pattern consistent with Parkinson's disease, when his medical records indicate he wasn't diagnosed until 3 months after this document was allegedly signed?" Thomas shifted slightly in his chair. "My brother had tremors for years before his diagnosis. Anyone who knew him could tell you that." The forensic accountant, Dr. Sarah Chun, handwriting analysis expert with 23 years of experience, opened a manila folder and slid a single document across the table. It was a check my father had signed 2 days before the will in question. The signature was rock-steady, controlled, precise. "This is interesting," Dr. Chun said, her tone conversational, almost gentle, "because this signature from 2 days earlier shows absolutely no tremor whatsoever. In fact, Mr. Brennan, it's biomechanically impossible for someone to control Parkinson's tremors selectively." She paused, her eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "Which means one of these signatures is fake." Thomas's lawyer leaned over and whispered urgently in his ear. But I was watching Thomas's face. I was watching 30 years of careful planning collapse in real time, because in that moment he knew we had him. Dr. Chun pulled out a second document, a contract Thomas had signed just 3 weeks earlier. She placed it beside my father's alleged will. "The pressure patterns on the forged signature match your grip exactly, Mr. Thomas. The hand position, the angle, even the way you dot your I's." She looked up at him with the calm certainty of someone who has spent decades turning lies into mathematical proof. Then she said the 3 words that would send my uncle to federal prison for fraud. "You wrote this. Welcome to family reckoning. I'm sharing this story today because greed has a way of making intelligent people do spectacularly stupid things. And sometimes, the truth isn't just revealed. It's calculated, measured, and proven beyond any reasonable doubt. Let's connect. Drop your city or country in the comments below, so I know where you're watching from. Also, please note this video contains fictionalized elements for storytelling and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual people or places is purely coincidental, but the core message about document fraud and family betrayal is very real. The smell of sawdust and machine oil is something that gets into your DNA when you grow up in a manufacturing family. Brennan Industrial Tools occupied 43 acres on the south side of Detroit, producing precision cutting equipment for automotive and aerospace companies. The factory floor hummed 24 hours a day with the sound of metal meeting metal at incredibly high tolerances. My father, Patrick Brennan, built the company from a single garage shop in 1978. He was 58 years old when I was born, having focused entirely on building the business through his 30s and 40s before meeting my mother. By the time I could walk, I was spending weekends in that factory, wearing tiny safety glasses and hard hat, watching massive CNC machines carve steel with surgical precision. "Manufacturing isn't about making things, Michael," Dad would tell me, his voice carrying over the industrial hum. "It's about solving problems. Every piece of metal that comes through here represents someone's challenge. Our job is to give them exactly what they need, when they need it, with no margin for error." I became a mechanical engineer because of him. I understood tolerances, specifications, and the undeniable mathematics of metal fatigue. More importantly, I understood the culture of precision that drove everything we built. My Uncle Thomas was Dad's younger brother by 7 years. He had joined the company in the early 80s, when it was still small enough for family roles to be fluid and overlapping. Thomas was charming, articulate, and possessed a natural talent for sales and client relationships that complemented Dad's engineering focus perfectly. The division of labor seemed natural. Dad ran operations, research, development, production, quality control. Thomas ran the business side, sales, contracts, finance, client management. For nearly 20 years, it worked beautifully. The company grew from 12 employees to over 200. We expanded into government contracts, aerospace applications, medical device components. By 2018, Brennan Industrial Tools was valued at just over $50 million. That was when the problems started. The first sign was subtle. Thomas began scheduling client meetings and board discussions during times when Dad was occupied with production issues. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual shift in who was making strategic decisions about the company's direction. Your father is brilliant with the technical side, Thomas would say during family dinners at his house, swirling wine in a glass that cost more than most people's monthly salary. But business strategy isn't really his forte. He gets bogged down in engineering details when we need to be thinking bigger picture. These comments were always delivered with a smile, always framed as affectionate concern rather than criticism. But they established a narrative. Dad was the nuts and bolts guy, Thomas was the visionary. The narrative became self-reinforcing. When potential clients visited, Thomas positioned himself as the primary point of contact. He would introduce Dad as our chief engineer, rather than the founder and CEO. It was a subtle title demotion that most people wouldn't notice, but it systematically reduced Dad's apparent authority in his own company. Thomas has been handling more of the strategic planning lately. Dad told me one evening in late 2019. We were in his home office, reviewing quarterly reports. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. He says I should focus on what I do best, the engineering side. Let him worry about the business development. How do you feel about that? I asked. Dad was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee mug in his hands. I built this company, Michael. Every machine, every process, every client relationship. But Thomas makes a good point. I'm 79 years old. Maybe it's time to trust the next generation to take the lead. What I didn't understand at the time was that Thomas wasn't positioning himself as the next generation. He was positioning himself as the current generation, and Dad as the previous one. The company structure was fairly straightforward. Dad owned 60% of the shares, Thomas owned 30%, and 10% was held in an employee stock ownership plan. As long as Dad maintained control, the company direction was ultimately his decision. But Thomas began a careful campaign to change that dynamic. He started bringing in outside consultants, business efficiency experts, organizational development specialists, strategic planning firms. All of them delivered the same basic recommendation. The company needed clearer leadership structure and more defined roles for senior management. What they're saying makes sense, Pat. Thomas would argue during board meetings. We need to formalize the decision-making process. Having co-leadership creates confusion for the employees and the clients. The efficiency experts recommended that Thomas be named president and COO, with Dad retaining the ceremonial title of chairman and founder. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like a natural evolution for a growing company. But what it really meant was that Thomas would control day-to-day operations while Dad became a figurehead. Dad agreed to it in early 2020, during the chaos of the pandemic when everyone was focused on keeping the business solvent rather than internal power dynamics. That was his first mistake. The second mistake was trusting Thomas to handle the legal paperwork for the restructuring. I'll have the lawyers draw up the new corporate documents, Thomas offered. No need for you to get bogged down in legal minutiae, Pat. You've got enough on your plate keeping production running during the supply chain crisis. Dad signed the documents without reading them carefully. He trusted his brother. He trusted 30 years of successful partnership. What he didn't know was that Thomas had included provisions in the restructuring that gave him authority to make major financial decisions without board approval during emergency circumstances. And Thomas had a very broad definition of what constituted an emergency. By 2021, Thomas was essentially running the company while Dad focused on engineering challenges and production issues. Dad still held the majority shares, but Thomas controlled the operational authority. Then, in March of 2022, Dad was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's is a cruel disease. It doesn't just attack your motor functions, it attacks your confidence. Dad had built his entire identity around precision, control, and mechanical reliability. Watching his hands develop a slight tremor, seeing his handwriting become less controlled, knowing that his condition would only worsen, it devastated him psychologically in ways that went far beyond the physical symptoms. Thomas's response was immediately supportive and completely calculating. Pat, you need to focus on your health, he said during a family meeting the week after the diagnosis. Let me take more of the operational burden off your shoulders. The stress of running the business isn't good for your condition. It sounded caring. It sounded like exactly what a concerned younger brother should say. But Thomas used the diagnosis as leverage to accelerate his takeover of the company. He brought in medical consultants who confirmed that stress could worsen Parkinson's symptoms. He hired disability employment specialists who recommended reducing Dad's responsibilities to preserve his long-term health. Every decision was framed as protective care rather than a power grab. Within 6 months, Dad had been effectively pushed out of all strategic decision-making. He still came to the factory every day, but his role had become advisory rather than authoritative. Thomas made the major contracts, handled client relationships, and controlled the financial planning. Dad hated it, but he felt trapped. His tremor was becoming more noticeable. His energy levels were inconsistent. And Thomas kept reinforcing the narrative that stepping back was the responsible choice. "You built something amazing, Pat," Thomas would say. "Now let me protect what you built while you focus on protecting your health." The manipulation was brilliant because it was built on a foundation of genuine medical concern. Dad couldn't argue against managing his Parkinson's symptoms. But every accommodation Thomas made for Dad's condition also reduced Dad's authority and increased Thomas's control. I watched this happening from my position as a senior engineer in the company. I saw Dad becoming more isolated, more dependent on Thomas's interpretation of business matters, more convinced that he was a burden rather than an asset. But I also saw something else. I saw Thomas systematically restructuring the company finances in ways that seemed designed to benefit him specifically rather than the business generally. "Dad," I said during one of our weekly dinners at his house in December 2022, "have you reviewed the recent expense reports? Thomas has been taking some pretty significant consulting fees from outside clients." Dad looked confused. "Consulting fees?" "He's billing other companies for strategic advice, using our company resources, office space, administrative support, even some of our proprietary market research. But the fees are going to his personal consulting LLC, not to Brennan Industrial." Dad's hand trembled slightly as he set down his fork. "I'm sure it's legitimate, Michael. Thomas handles all the business development now. I don't have the energy to micromanage his client relationships." Thomas was using the company's infrastructure to build his own side business. He was leveraging relationships with Brennan Industrial's clients to generate personal income. And he was doing it all while positioning himself as the company's indispensable leader. The pattern became clear to me, but I couldn't get Dad to see it. Every time I raised concerns about Thomas's activities, Dad would shut down the conversation. "Thomas has been carrying most of the load while I've been dealing with my health issues," Dad would say. "I'm not going to second-guess his business judgment when he's been keeping this company profitable." I realized that Dad's illness had created a perfect cover for Thomas's gradual takeover. Dad was too exhausted and too grateful for Thomas's help to question his methods. But I kept documenting everything. Expense reports, consulting contracts, client communications. I had a feeling I was going to need evidence eventually. I just didn't know how soon eventually would arrive. Dad collapsed at the factory on a Tuesday morning in March 2023. Massive heart attack. He was unconscious when the paramedics arrived and never regained consciousness. He passed away 3 days later in the ICU at Detroit Medical Center. I was with him when he died. Thomas was in Chicago on a business trip, closing what he said was the largest contract in company history. The funeral was held the following Saturday. Thomas delivered a eulogy that was perfect, touching, respectful, and carefully crafted to position himself as Dad's chosen successor rather than his surviving business partner. "Pat and I built this company together," Thomas told the packed church. "But more than that, we built it for the future, for the families who depend on us for their livelihoods, for the clients who trust us to solve their most challenging problems." Pat's greatest pride was knowing that the company would continue to thrive after he was gone. He spent his final years preparing me to carry on his legacy. After the funeral, Thomas approached me in the church parking lot. "Michael," he said, putting his hand on my shoulder with practiced sympathy. "I know this is a difficult time, but we need to talk about the business. Your father and I had some discussions about succession planning before he passed. I think you'll be pleased with the arrangements he made." I looked at him carefully. "What kind of arrangements?" "Let's discuss it after the will reading," Thomas said. "Arthur Mitchell has scheduled it for next Wednesday. Everything will be clear then." Arthur Mitchell had been Dad's attorney for 15 years. He was a careful, methodical man who specialized in business succession planning. I trusted him completely, which is why what happened at the will reading was so shocking. Before I tell you about the moment that changed everything, the moment 3 words from a forensic expert destroyed my uncle's perfect crime, Let me know you're still invested. Comment, "Still here?" or drop 100 points below so I know you're following along. What comes next is where 30 years of careful planning collided with 21st century science. And just a heads up, the following events incorporate some dramatic storytelling elements for educational purposes. If that's not your style, feel free to click away now. But if you want to see exactly how document forgery gets exposed in federal court, let's keep going. Arthur Mitchell's office was in a restored Victorian mansion downtown, the kind of place where important family matters had been handled for generations. His conference room was paneled in dark wood, lined with law books, and equipped with the heavy furniture that suggests permanence and reliability. I arrived at 2 p.m. sharp. Thomas was already there, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. He was checking his phone with the casual confidence of someone who knew exactly how the next hour would unfold. "Michael," he said, standing to shake my hand, "I'm glad we're finally getting this sorted out. Your father was very thoughtful about his planning." Arthur Mitchell entered carrying a thick manila folder. He was a man in his late 60s, with the careful demeanor of someone who had delivered both good and devastating news to families for 4 decades. "Gentlemen," he said, settling behind his desk, "thank you both for coming. We're here for the reading of Patrick Brennan's last will and testament, dated February 15, 2023. I felt my stomach drop. February 15th was just 3 weeks before Dad died. 3 weeks after his Parkinson's symptoms had become significantly worse. 3 weeks when he was barely coming to the office because his energy levels were so inconsistent. "I should note," Arthur continued, "that this will supersede all previous testamentary documents. Patrick came to me specifically to make substantial changes to his estate planning." Thomas nodded gravely, as though this was exactly what he had expected. Arthur opened the folder and began reading. The legal language flowed over the room like cold water. Revocation of prior wills, appointment of executor, which was Thomas, of course, payment of debts and final expenses. Then came the distribution of assets. "To my son Michael Brennan, I leave my gratitude for his dedication to the company and his passion for engineering excellence. I leave him my personal tools, my technical library, and the sum of $200,000 to help him establish his own engineering practice." $200,000. From a $50 million estate. "To my brother Thomas Brennan," Arthur continued, "I leave my absolute trust and confidence in his leadership abilities. I bequeath to Thomas my entire ownership stake in Brennan Industrial Tools, including all shares, assets, intellectual property, and operational control. I further leave to Thomas my personal residence, investment accounts, and all remaining assets not otherwise specified." The silence in the room was complete. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his expression carefully arranged into surprise and humility. "I had no idea Pat was planning anything this comprehensive," he said. "Michael, I want you to know that I'll always consider you a partner in everything we built." I stared at Arthur Mitchell. "Mr. Mitchell, when exactly did my father come to see you about changing his will?" "February 15th, Arthur replied, consulting his notes. "He called that morning and said he needed to update his testamentary documents immediately. He came in that afternoon with very specific instructions about how he wanted his estate distributed." "Was anyone with him?" "No, he came alone, although he did mention that Thomas had been advising him about succession planning. He said Thomas had helped him think through the implications of different distribution strategies." "Mr. Mitchell," I said carefully, "how did my father seem to you that day? Was he alert? Was his handwriting steady?" Arthur looked uncomfortable. "Michael, your father was clearly dealing with health challenges. His hand shook when he signed the documents, but he was mentally alert and able to articulate his wishes clearly. I would never have allowed him to sign if I had any doubts about his competency." I looked at Thomas. He was nodding sympathetically, playing the role of the grieving brother who had inherited an unexpected burden. "Arthur," Thomas said, "I think Michael is just having trouble accepting Pat's decision. It's understandable. Grief makes us question things that don't fit our expectations. But I wasn't questioning Dad's decision. I was questioning whether Dad had actually made it." That evening, I went home to my apartment and sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, trying to make sense of what had happened. Dad had always told me the company would be mine someday. Not immediately. I was only 34 and needed more experience. But eventually, We had discussed it dozens of times over the years. More importantly, Dad was a careful planner. His previous will, drawn up in 2019, had left Thomas 30% of the company and me 60%, with 10% remaining in the employee stock plan. It was a distribution that reflected both family relationships and actual contributions to the business. For him to completely reverse that decision and leave Thomas everything while giving me essentially nothing, that represented a fundamental change in his assessment of both of us. And I couldn't think of anything that would justify such a dramatic shift, unless Thomas had convinced him that I was planning to sell the company, or that I was incompetent, or that I represented some kind of threat to the business he'd spent his life building. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Thomas had been positioning me as a liability for months. Subtle comments about my lack of business experience. Suggestions that I was too technical to understand strategic planning. Implications that my engineering focus made me unsuitable for leadership. Thomas had spent years building a narrative in which he was the reliable business mind and I was the impractical dreamer. If he had convinced Dad of that narrative during Dad's final, vulnerable weeks, it would explain everything. But it still felt wrong. The timing, the completeness of the disinheritance, the fact that Thomas had been advising Dad about succession planning right before Dad decided to leave him everything. I made a decision that would change everything. I called a lawyer. Jennifer Walsh specialized in will contests. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with the sharp focus of someone who had built a practice around fighting for people who'd been cheated out of their inheritance. Will contests are difficult, she told me during our initial consultation. The burden of proof is high. You need to show either diminished capacity, fraud, or undue influence. And even then, you're fighting an uphill battle against the presumption that people have the right to dispose of their property however they choose. What would constitute proof of fraud? I asked. Document forgery would be the most clear-cut case, she said. If you could prove that your father didn't actually sign the will, that someone else created or altered it, that would be fraud. But proving document forgery requires expert analysis, and it's expensive. How expensive? A comprehensive forensic document examination runs about $15,000. Handwriting analysis, paper testing, ink dating, the full investigation. It was a lot of money, especially since I'd just learned I was inheriting $200,000 instead of $25 million. But something about the whole situation felt fundamentally wrong. Let's do it, I said. Jennifer filed a formal will contest with the probate court. As part of the discovery process, we subpoenaed all documents related to Dad's estate planning, including the original will and all drafts, notes, and supporting materials from Arthur Mitchell's office. What we found was immediately suspicious. The will was typed on standard legal paper, nothing unusual there. But the signature looked wrong to me in ways I couldn't articulate. It was recognizably Dad's handwriting, but something about the pressure, the angle, the way certain letters were formed, it didn't look natural. Jennifer arranged for the document to be examined by Dr. Sarah Chun, a forensic handwriting analyst who had testified in over 200 court cases involving document fraud. Dr. Chen's initial assessment was devastating to Thomas's case. This signature shows multiple red flags consistent with forgery, she told us during a conference call. The pressure patterns are inconsistent with natural handwriting. The tremor pattern doesn't match what we'd expect from someone with early-stage Parkinson's disease. And most importantly, there are hesitation marks, places where the forger paused to check their work, that wouldn't appear in an authentic signature. But Dr. Chun needed comparison samples to make a definitive determination. We needed examples of Dad's authentic handwriting from around the same time period, and we needed samples of Thomas's handwriting to test whether he was the forger. That's when I remembered something that would prove crucial. Dad had been keeping a daily journal for years, documenting technical improvements to manufacturing processes, notes about client interactions, ideas for new product development. The journal was in his desk at the factory. Thomas hadn't bothered to clean out Dad's office yet. He was too busy consolidating his control over the broader company operations. I went to the factory on a Saturday when I knew Thomas wouldn't be there. Dad's office was exactly as he'd left it. The journal was in the top drawer of his desk, filled with entries in his distinctive handwriting dating up until the week before he died. The final entry was dated March 10th, 5 days before his heart attack. His handwriting was shaky but clearly his own, and it said something that made my blood run cold. Thomas brought more legal papers today, says they're just updates to corporate structure, but they look like estate planning documents to me. I told him I need to review with Arthur first. He seemed upset. Says we need to move quickly for tax reasons. Something doesn't feel right. Need to call Michael. Dad had been suspicious of Thomas in his final days, and he'd planned to call me about it. He never got the chance. I photographed every page of the journal and sent them to Dr. Chun immediately. When she compared Dad's authentic handwriting from March 10th to the signature on the will allegedly signed on February 15th, the fraud became mathematically undeniable. The alleged will signature shows tremor patterns consistent with advanced Parkinson's disease, Dr. Chen explained. But the journal entries from 3 weeks later show much steadier handwriting. It's biomechanically impossible for Parkinson's symptoms to improve over time. They only get worse. More importantly, when Dr. Chun compared the forged signature to samples of Thomas's handwriting, obtained through subpoenas of his business contracts and personal correspondence, the match was perfect. The pressure patterns, the letter formations, the specific way he dots his I's and crosses his T's, Dr. Chun said. Thomas Brennan wrote this signature. There's no doubt about it. The case went to trial 8 months later. Thomas had hired expensive attorneys who argued that Dad's Parkinson's symptoms were inconsistent and unpredictable, that the signature variations could be explained by medication timing and stress levels. But Dr. Chen's testimony was unshakable. She walked the jury through the scientific analysis, showing them microscopic pressure patterns, biomechanical impossibilities, and statistical comparisons that proved beyond reasonable doubt that Thomas had forged Dad's signature. The moment that broke Thomas's case came during cross-examination. Thomas's attorney was trying to discredit Dr. Chen's methodology, suggesting that handwriting analysis wasn't reliable enough for criminal prosecution. Dr. Chan, the attorney said, isn't it possible that stress and illness could cause signature variations that your analysis might mistake for forgery? Dr. Chun pulled out a blown-up photograph of the contested signature and placed it on an easel facing the jury. Mr. Patterson, she said calmly, I've analyzed over 3,000 question signatures in my career. I've seen every possible variation caused by illness, stress, medication, and aging. She pointed to specific areas of the signature with a laser pointer. This signature wasn't written by someone with Parkinson's disease. It was written by someone trying to simulate Parkinson's symptoms. She moved the laser to show the hesitation marks, the artificially induced tremor patterns, the places where the forger had overcorrected. But more importantly, Dr. Chan continued, the person who wrote this signature has a very distinctive way of forming the letter P in Patrick. Look at this loop structure, the specific angle of the downstroke. She clicked to the next slide, showing one of Thomas's business signatures. This is how Thomas Brennan forms the letter P in his own name. Identical loop structure. Identical downstroke angle. The muscle memory patterns are unmistakable. Thomas's attorney tried to object, but Dr. Chun wasn't finished. Mr. Patterson, in 23 years of forensic analysis, I have never seen a coincidence like this. The statistical probability of two different people having identical biomechanical patterns for complex letter formations is essentially zero. She looked directly at Thomas, who had gone pale in his chair. This signature was written by Thomas Brennan, she said with absolute certainty. There is no other scientifically supportable explanation. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned a verdict invalidating the forged will and reinstating Dad's previous testament, which left me 60% of the company. But more importantly, the district attorney had been monitoring the trial. 2 weeks after the civil verdict, Thomas was arrested on federal charges of document forgery, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The federal case was even more devastating, because Thomas hadn't just forged a will. He had used the forged document to obtain control of federal defense contracts worth millions of dollars. That made it a federal crime with a mandatory minimum sentence. Thomas pleaded guilty to avoid a longer trial. He was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution for all financial damages caused by his fraud. Dr. Chen's 3 words, "You wrote this," had not only exposed the forgery but triggered a federal investigation that revealed years of financial crimes. I'm running Brennan Industrial Tools now. We've grown by 40% in the past 2 years, expanding into renewable energy manufacturing and medical device components. The company Dad built is stronger than it's ever been. Thomas was released from federal prison last month after serving 5 years. His engineering license was permanently revoked. His house was seized to pay restitution. His reputation in the industry is completely destroyed. I don't feel sorry for him. He spent years manipulating a sick old man, systematically isolating Dad from family and friends, and ultimately forged legal documents to steal everything Dad had worked his entire life to build. But I learned something important from this experience. Sophisticated criminals don't usually get caught because they're obvious. They get caught because they overestimate their own intelligence and underestimate the power of modern forensic science. Thomas thought he could create a perfect forgery because he'd been watching Dad's signature deteriorate for months due to Parkinson's disease. He thought adding artificial tremors would make the fraud undetectable. He thought no one would question a will that seemed to reflect the power dynamics he'd been carefully constructing for years. What he didn't understand is that forensic science has advanced to the point where human handwriting is as distinctive as a fingerprint. Every muscle memory pattern, every pressure variation, every tiny hesitation is measurable and unique. Dr. Chun didn't just analyze handwriting. She analyzed the biomechanical patterns that create handwriting. And those patterns can't be faked by someone who doesn't understand the neuroscience behind them. If there's one thing this experience taught me about family and trust, it's this: document everything. Keep records. Pay attention to patterns that don't make sense. When someone you trust starts isolating an elderly family member, when they begin controlling access to legal and financial advisors, when they're suddenly eager to handle all the paperwork, those are red flags that require investigation. And if you ever suspect document fraud, don't hesitate to fight it. Modern forensic science can expose lies that would have been impossible to detect even 20 years ago. The truth has a mathematical structure that fraud cannot replicate. Criminals can fool people, but they cannot fool physics. These family stories aren't easy to tell. It requires admitting that someone you loved and trusted spent years planning to destroy your life. But I believe they need to be told because document fraud is more common than most people realize, and the victims are usually trusting family members who don't know what to look for. If the story resonated with you, if you've ever watched someone manipulate a vulnerable family member, I want you to know, trust your instincts. Question things that don't make sense. And remember that modern science has tools for finding truth that criminals can't anticipate. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it helped you understand something about your own family dynamics, or if you think someone else needs to hear it, please share it. Subscribe to Family Reckoning so you never miss another story about how families fight for truth against powerful people who think they're above the law. And remember, handwriting doesn't lie, but the people who forge it always do.